Get comfortable. Tonight you are going to wake up in a body that is not quite your own, in a bedroom in a tall brick house in England, on an ordinary morning in the year 1880, and you are going to discover that the morning of a Victorian lady, the woman of leisure, the woman who supposedly did nothing all day, was one of the most quietly demanding stretches of hours in her entire life. You have probably imagined this morning as ease, a lady waking late in a soft bed, ringing a little bell, being brought her breakfast on a tray, drifting through a few gentle hours of nothing very much, before an afternoon of calls and an evening of pleasure. And there is a version of the morning that looks a little like that from the outside, if you are standing far enough away and not looking very hard. But step closer, come right into the room, and the ease dissolves into something far more structured, far more effortful, and far more interesting. The morning was work. It was the work of turning a sleeping woman into a fully assembled lady, and then the work of turning that lady loose on the running of an entire household, and none of it was as simple or as idle as the word morning suggests. Before we go any further, if you enjoy this kind of history, the slow and close and human kind, take a moment to subscribe and to leave a like. It helps this small channel more than you would think. And if you would like to, leave a comment telling me where you are listening from and what the hour is where you are. I always like to know who is out there in the quiet. Now let the room go still, and let us go back. It is 1880. The place is England. A good house on a good street, in one of the prosperous districts of a large town, or perhaps in one of the comfortable squares of London itself. Your husband is a man of business, or a professional man, a solicitor, or a physician, or a partner in some flourishing concern, and his income is a good one, enough to keep a household of several servants and to place your family securely among the upper middle class, the class that lived like the gentry on a slightly smaller scale and worked very hard to make sure the difference did not show. You are somewhere in your 30s. You have children, in the nursery and the schoolroom upstairs, in the care of a nurse and a governess. You have a household of servants below you, a cook, a housemaid, a parlour-maid, perhaps a lady's maid of your own if the household runs to it, and the young between-maid who does the roughest work. And this house, with all its people and all its rooms and all its endless daily needs, is your responsibility, your work, your profession, though no one would ever call it that. You are its manager, and the managing of it begins the moment you wake, which is now, in the grey, early light, as the sounds of the house stirring below you reach the bedroom where you are just opening your eyes. Let us begin the morning together and see what it was truly made of, hour by hour, from the first grey light to the moment when the morning's work is done and the day proper begins. Here is the thing that is easiest to get wrong about your morning, and it is worth settling before we go any further, because everything that follows depends on it. The great fiction of a woman in your position, the fiction that the whole of society agreed to maintain, was that you did not work. You were a lady. A lady did not labor. A lady was kept, provided for, sheltered from the hard world of getting and spending, free to occupy herself with the gentle and the decorative and the domestic. That was the story, and it was told everywhere, in the etiquette books and the sermons and the magazines, and it described a life of managed leisure that was held up as the very summit of female good fortune. And the truth, which you know in your body every single morning, is that the maintenance of that fiction was itself an enormous quantity of work. Somebody had to run the household that kept you looking kept. Somebody had to manage the servants, order the food, keep the accounts, direct the cleaning, plan the meals, oversee the children's care, maintain the family's social standing through an endless round of calls and correspondence, and careful attention to 100 small rules. And that somebody was you. The leisured lady was, in practice, the manager of a small and complicated enterprise, on duty from waking to sleeping, and the leisure was the appearance the enterprise was run to produce. So when we say we are going to watch your morning, understand what we are really going to watch. We are going to watch a woman do a great deal of skilled and demanding work, all of it arranged so as to look like no work at all. The looking like no work was part of the work. It was perhaps the hardest part. And the morning, when the household was assembled and set in motion for the day, and the lady herself was assembled and set in motion along with it, was when the largest share of that hidden work was done. Keep that in mind as the grey light strengthens and the morning begins, because it is the key to everything you are about to see. Let us begin then where the morning begins, which is not with your waking, but with someone else's. Long before your eyes open in the grey light, the machinery of the house has already been set in motion by hands other than yours, and it is worth seeing that first, because your comfortable morning rests entirely upon it. The first person awake in your house is the youngest and lowest of the servants, the maid of all work, or the housemaid, who has risen in the cold and the dark, well before 6, to begin the long list of tasks that must be finished before the family stirs. She has come down to a cold house and made it warm. She has cleaned the grates where yesterday's fires burned down to ash, and blacked the kitchen range, and laid and lit the new fires, so that the rooms the family will use are warming by the time the family enters them. She has swept the floors and dusted the rooms, and cleaned the front steps, and polished whatever needs polishing, all in the early dark, all before her own breakfast, so that the house the family wakes to appears to have made itself clean and warm by some invisible magic in the night. This is the foundation of your morning, and it is worth naming clearly. The warmth in your bedroom when you wake is warmth that a young woman rose in the cold to make. The fire in the grate was laid and lit by hands that were cold doing it. The hot water that will be brought up for your washing was heated on a range that someone blacked and lit before dawn. The entire comfortable stage on which your morning will unfold was set, quietly, in the dark, by servants who were working for 2 hours or more before you opened your eyes, and who will go on working long after you have gone up to bed at night. Your leisure is built on their labor, hour by hour, and the smoothness of your morning is the measure of how well and how invisibly that labor is done. But let us come to your own waking now, in the strengthening grey light, as the sounds of the house at work reach up to the bedroom, and the long and structured business of your own morning begins. You wake a little after 7. The room is dim still, the curtains drawn, but there is grey light at their edges, and the fire that was laid in your bedroom grate is burning, taking the worst of the chill from the air. The bedroom of a lady in 1880 was a substantial room, and a cold one by our standards, for even with the fire, the corners of it held the night's chill, and the getting out of a warm bed into that air was the first small trial of the day. The bed itself is worth a moment, because you have spent the night in more construction than you might expect. The mattress rests on a frame with ropes or a base beneath it, and the mattress itself is likely to be several layers, a hard under mattress of horsehair and a softer feather bed on top, and the whole made up with linen sheets and woolen blankets, and a counterpane over all. You have slept in a nightgown of white cotton or linen, long and high-necked and entirely enveloping, and your hair, which we will come to, has been dealt with for the night in a way that must now be undone. You have slept, in short, in a manner as structured in its way as your waking hours, and the unmaking of the night and the making of the day is the work now beginning. There is a bell rope by the bed, or a bell pull, and when you are ready, you will ring it, and the ringing of it sends a signal down through the house to the servants below that the mistress is awake, and will shortly want her hot water and her early tea. But you do not ring it at once. There is a particular quality to these first waking minutes, before the day has been formally begun, before the machinery has been set in motion by that first pull of the bell, and many women valued them, the few private minutes of lying still in the warming room, gathering the day in the mind before it begins in earnest. For once the bell is rung, the morning takes hold, and it does not let go again for many hours. So you lie still for a little while in the dim warming room, and you think through the day ahead, because a great deal of it must be held in your mind, and it is best to take it up now, in the quiet, before the interruptions begin. There is the matter of the dinner tonight, and whether the fishmonger sent what was ordered. There is the housemaid's work to be checked, for you were not satisfied with the drawing room yesterday. There is a call you owe, and must pay this morning, and a letter that must be answered before the noon post. There is the nursery, and the question of the youngest child's cough, and whether the doctor need be sent for. There is the cook to be seen, and the day's meals to be settled, and the household books to be gone over, for it is the morning you do the accounts. All of this assembles itself in your mind as you lie in the grey light, and none of it is leisure, and all of it is yours. And when you have it clear, you reach out at last and ring the bell, and the morning begins. The answer to the bell comes up the stairs within a few minutes, in the form of the housemaid, or your own maid if you keep one, carrying a can of hot water and, very likely, a small tray with the early cup of tea that was one of the quiet pleasures of a comfortable morning. The hot water is the important thing, for there is no tap in your bedroom, no bathroom in the modern sense in most houses, even of this comfortable class in 1880, and every drop of water for your washing must be carried up the stairs by hand, heated below, and brought up in a covered can, and poured into the basin on your washstand. Look at the washstand, because it is the center of the morning's washing, and it tells you a great deal about how different this morning is from ours. It is a piece of furniture, a stand of wood with a marble top, and on it sits the great matched set of china that every well-appointed bedroom held. There is the large basin, wide and deep. There is the tall water jug, the ewer, that holds the cold water. There is now the can of hot water brought up by the maid to be mixed with the cold to the temperature you like. There is the soap in its dish, and the smaller jug and glass for the teeth, and the sponge, and beneath the stand or beside it, the slop pail into which the used water will be poured when you are done, to be carried down again by hand, for what comes up must also go down, every drop of it, on the labor of the servants. The washing itself, for most women of this class in 1880, was not the full immersion in a bath that we would think of. A full bath was a considerable undertaking, the water all carried and heated, and the bath itself filled by hand, and it was done perhaps once a week, often less. The daily washing was done standing at the washstand, with the basin and the sponge and the flannel, a thorough washing of the body in sections, the water warmed to the comfort of the skin, the whole conducted in the cool air of the bedroom, with the fire doing its best against the chill. It was an efficient and a practiced thing, this stand-up wash, and it kept a woman perfectly clean, and it was the ordinary daily reality of washing for almost everyone, in an age before the bathroom, with its endless hot water, had come to seem a necessity of life. Consider the water itself for a moment, because the simple fact of it, hot water in a can carried up a staircase, opens onto one of the great differences between that world and ours, and onto a good deal of hidden labor besides. In a house without plumbing to the upper floors, and that meant most houses in 1880, water was carried, all of it. The water for your morning wash, the water for the children's washing, the water for the great weekly wash of the laundry, the water for the kitchen and the cooking and the endless cleaning. Every drop of it was pumped or drawn below and carried by hand to where it was needed and carried away again when it was used. Water is heavy. A gallon of it weighs some 10 pounds, and a can holds several gallons, and the staircases of a tall Victorian house were many and steep. The carrying of water was one of the great unremarked labors of the Victorian house, falling on the youngest and strongest of the servants, up and down the stairs, hour after hour, day after day, so that the family might have water where and when it wanted it, without ever thinking about how it came to be there. And the heating of it was labor too. The hot water came from the kitchen range, the great iron stove that was the heart of the working house, and the range had to be lit and fed and tended constantly to keep the water hot, and the tending of the range was itself a black and dirty and endless job. The clean hot water that arrived at your washstand in its covered can had at its far end a young woman with coal dust on her hands, feeding a fire in a hot kitchen below, so that the mistress upstairs might wash in warmth and comfort and never see the fire or the coal or the labor at all. This is the pattern of the whole morning, and indeed of the whole house, and it is worth fixing clearly in the mind now, at the washstand, because we will see it again and again. Every comfort of your morning has a hidden cost in someone else's labor, and the measure of a well-run house was precisely that the cost stayed hidden, that the comfort arrived smoothly, and the labor behind it never showed. You wash in warm water in a warm room, and the warmth and the water are the near end of a long chain of carrying and heating and tending that reaches down into the cold early morning, and the coal cellar, and the hands of the servants, and the smoothness with which it all arrives is not an absence of labor. It is labor so well organized that it has been made invisible, which is a different thing entirely. Washed and dried with the rough towel that the age believed was good for the skin, you come now to the great central labor of the morning, the one that more than any other defined the physical experience of being a Victorian lady, and that is the getting dressed. And here we must slow right down, because the dressing of a lady in 1880 was not the quick business it is for us. It was a process of many stages and many garments, some of which you could manage yourself and some of which you could not, and it built the body up, layer by layer, from the bare skin to the finished and formal outer dress, into the shaped and structured and entirely constructed thing that a lady's body was required to be. But we must begin with a distinction, because the morning had two dressings in it, not one, and the difference between them matters. There was the first dressing, the informal one, done on rising, that put you into a comfortable loose garment suitable for the early and private hours of the morning, for your own bedroom, and for breakfast with the family, and for the first business of the household before the outside world was admitted. And there was the second dressing, the real and formal one, done later in the morning, that put you into the full structured day dress in which you would receive callers and go out and be seen. Many a lady's morning had this shape, the loose, informal early hours, and then the formal assembling before the social day began, and it is worth understanding both. So the first thing you put on, over the clean skin, is the chemise, the simple shift of white cotton or linen that was the innermost layer of everything, the garment worn next to the body under all the rest. It is loose and plain, falling to the knee or below, and it does the essential work of protecting the outer garments from the body and the body from the outer garments, for the elaborate dresses of the period could not themselves be easily washed, and the chemise, which could be washed, stood between them and the skin and took the wear. Over the chemise, on the legs, the drawers, the split and open undergarment that the age required, and on the feet the stockings, drawn up and secured, of wool or cotton for the day, held up by garters. And then, over the chemise, comes the garment that shaped the whole age, the one that everyone thinks of when they think of how a Victorian woman was dressed, and that deserves all the attention we are about to give it, the corset. The corset of 1880 was a serious piece of engineering, and to understand the mourning, and indeed the whole physical life of the woman wearing it, you have to understand what it actually was and what it actually did, because a great deal of nonsense has been attached to it in the years since, and the truth is more interesting than the nonsense. The corset was a shaped and stiffened garment that enclosed the torso from the bust to the hips, laced tight at the back and fastened at the front, and its purpose was to mold the body to the fashionable line, to support the bust, to narrow the waist, and to provide the smooth and rigid foundation over which the outer garments were fitted. It was made of strong cotton or a fabric called coutil, woven especially for the purpose, and it was stiffened with strips of bone, which by 1880 usually meant not whalebone but steel, thin, flexible strips of it set into channels in the fabric, and with a rigid busk of steel down the front that fastened with studs and loops and held the front of the body straight. It was laced up the back through many small eyelets, and the lacing was how the fit and the tightness were controlled, drawn in and tied to shape the waist to the degree that fashion and the individual required. Now, the getting into the corset was one of the parts of the mourning that a woman could not easily manage entirely alone, and here the presence or absence of a maid shaped the whole experience. The corset fastened at the front by the busk, which you could do yourself, but the lacing at the back, drawn to the right tension and tied, was far more easily done by another pair of hands, and a lady with a maid was laced by her maid, standing while the maid drew the laces smooth and firm and tied them, the daily small ritual of the tightening that began the formal dressing. A woman without a maid managed as she could, with laces arranged to be drawn from the front, or with the help of a housemaid, or by her own contortions, but the fully dressed lady of the comfortable classes was, as a rule, laced by someone, and the lacing was one of the small daily dependencies that the structure of the dress built into her life. Let us be clear and fair about the tightness, because this is where the nonsense has gathered. The popular picture of the corset is of an instrument of torture, laced to a cruel and dangerous and deforming tightness, crushing the organs and cracking the ribs, worn in vain and suffering pursuit of an impossibly tiny waist. And there were, certainly, women who laced very tight, and there was a real practice of tight lacing that the doctors and the dress reformers of the age argued against with genuine cause. But for the great majority of women, most of the time, the corset was not laced to torture. It was laced firmly, to shape and to support, snug but bearable, worn all day every day as an ordinary and unremarkable foundation garment, the way we might wear any close-fitting thing, uncomfortable perhaps by our standards, but entirely normal by theirs, so habitual that its wearer half forgot it was there. It shaped the body, and it constrained the body, and it was simply what one wore, the necessary foundation on which everything else was built. Over the corset comes the next layer, the corset cover, or camisole, a light garment worn over the corset to smooth its lines and protect the outer dress from its edges and hooks. And then the petticoats, and here the layers begin to build in earnest, for the fashionable skirt of 1880 required a foundation of petticoats beneath it to give it the proper shape and fall and fullness. There might be a plain under petticoat first, and then one or more further petticoats, of cotton or flannel for warmth in winter, of finer stuff nearer the top, trimmed at the hem where they might show, each one adding its layer to the structure that the outer skirt would sit upon. And this is the point at which to pause and count what is already on the body, because it is more than a modern person quite imagines. Next, the skin, the chemise, on the legs, the drawers and the stockings, over the chemise, the corset, laced and boned, over the corset cover, and over all that, the petticoats, layer upon layer. That is already 5 or 6 distinct garments, several of them substantial, before we have even reached the dress itself. And each of them was put on in its turn, in the correct order, in the cool of the bedroom, in a sequence so practiced that it happened almost without thought, and yet took real time to accomplish, morning after morning, all through a woman's life. The weight of it all is worth feeling, because we have lost any sense of it. The layers of cotton and flannel, and the corset with its steel, and the trimmed petticoats, added up to a real and considerable weight of clothing, carried on the body all day, every day, a weight that shaped how a woman moved, and how she sat, and how she got through the physical business of her day. And in 1880, over these underlayers, the outer skirts were themselves heavy, and the fashionable shape required still more structure at the back, the bustle, the arrangement of padding or framework that held the skirts out behind in the silhouette of the moment. Add the bustle to the petticoats, to the corset, to the layers beneath, and a fully dressed lady was carrying a substantial architecture of clothing on her body from morning to night, and had been trained from girlhood to carry it gracefully, to move within it as though it were nothing, so that the enormous constructed effort of the dress should appear as the effortless natural elegance of the lady. But here we must remember the distinction we drew a little while ago between the first informal dressing and the second formal one, because in the early morning you do not, in fact, put on the full structured day dress at once. In the first hours of the morning, a woman of your class did not go to the full formality of the receiving dress. She wore, over her underlayers, a looser and more comfortable garment made for exactly these early domestic hours, and the garment had several names and several forms, but the common one was the wrapper, or in a finer version, the dressing gown or the morning gown. The wrapper was, in plain terms, a loose, comfortable robe, a full-length gown that fastened down the front, cut loose or gathered to a sash, made to be put on easily over the basic underlayers and worn in the privacy of the home in the early part of the day. It was comfortable in a way the day dress was not. It did not require the full architecture beneath it, though a lighter morning corset was usually worn even so, for a lady did not go entirely unlaced, even in the privacy of the morning. It was made of washable stuff, often patterned or in a darker color to hide the marks of the morning's domestic work, and it was the garment in which a woman did the early business of her household, saw her cook, went over her accounts, took her breakfast with the family, all the private morning tasks before the formal social day began. And there were rules about it, of course, for there were rules about everything. The wrapper was for the private morning only. A lady did not receive formal callers in her wrapper, and she certainly did not go out in it. The etiquette books were firm on the point. A lady should never receive her morning callers in a wrapper, one of them declared, unless they called at an unusually early hour, or some unexpected demand upon her time made it impossible to change her dress after breakfast. The wrapper belonged to the family and the early hours and the private business of the house. When the time came to be seen by the world, it came off, and the full formal dressing began. But for now, in the early morning, the wrapper is what you wear, comfortable and loose and practical, and in it you go down to begin the first real work of your morning, which waits for you below. Before we follow you down, though, there is the hair, for a lady did not go down even to her family breakfast with her hair undone, and the arranging of the hair was one of the real skilled labors of the morning, and one that reveals, like everything else, the whole structure of the world you moved in. The fashionable hair of 1880 was long. A woman's hair was rarely cut, and it grew through her whole life to a great length, and the dressing of it, into the arrangements the age required, was a daily task of real skill and real time. In the night, the hair was worn in a loose plait, or bound up simply, to keep it from tangling, and in the morning, it must be taken down, brushed out thoroughly, and dressed up again into the smooth and structured style of the day. The brushing alone was a substantial business. The long hair brushed out its full length with many strokes, partly to dress it, and partly because the age believed, with some reason, that the brushing itself was good for the hair, distributing its natural oils and keeping it healthy in an era when it was washed only rarely. And then the dressing of it up, which was where the skill lay. The hair was arranged close and smooth over the head and gathered up behind into a coil or a knot or a more elaborate structure, pinned into place with the hairpins that every woman used by the dozen, and it might be padded out with pads or with saved combings to give it the fullness the fashion wanted, and finished with combs or a ribbon or whatever small ornament the day allowed. A lady with a maid was dressed by her maid, who developed real skill at it, and could produce arrangements a woman could not easily achieve on her own head. A lady without a maid did her own, working with 2 mirrors to see the back, her arms raised for the long minutes the dressing took, a small daily athletic feat of reaching and pinning that she had done so many times her hands knew it without her eyes. This was every morning. Every single morning of a woman's adult life began with this taking down and brushing out and dressing up of the long hair, a labor of many minutes and real skill, and it was only the beginning, only the hair, one item on the morning's long list. And it is a good moment to notice something that we will see all through this morning, which is how much of a woman's time and skill and daily labor went into the production and maintenance of her own appearance, the assembling each morning of the looked-at, presentable, correct surface that the world required a lady to present. The appearance was not a given. It was made, every morning, by hours of skilled work, most of it the woman's own, and the finished elegance that the world saw and took for granted was the daily product of a labor that the world preferred not to think about at all. The dressing table, at which so much of this morning's work was done, deserves a look of its own, for it was one of the most personal objects in a woman's life, and it held a whole small world of the tools and preparations of the toilette. The dressing table stood in the bedroom or in the dressing room adjoining it, and it was a piece of furniture made for exactly this purpose, low with drawers, and above it or upon it, the looking glass, the mirror that was the essential instrument of the whole business of dressing and hairdressing, often a glass that could be tilted, and in the finer arrangements, a triple glass with wings that let a woman see the sides and the back of her own head, without which the dressing of the hair behind was a matter of guesswork and contortion. Upon the table stood the array of the toilette, and the array was considerable. The brushes, of which there were several, for the hair and for the clothes, backed with silver or with tortoiseshell or with polished wood in the finer sets. The combs, the hand mirror, the little trays and boxes and pots that held the pins and the small necessities, the bottles of the preparations, the lavender water and the rose water and the various waters and creams ranged in their glass, the pincushion bristling with pins, the whole quiet apparatus of the making of appearance, laid out ready to hand, the tools of the daily work of the toilette. And the whole was often a matter of some beauty in itself, for the objects of the toilette were made to be pleasing, the silver-backed brushes and the cut glass bottles and the pretty boxes, a woman's dressing table being one of the places where she surrounded herself with objects chosen for their grace as much as their use. It was, in its way, her own particular territory within the house, the one small domain arranged entirely around her own person and her own daily needs, and the sitting down at it each morning, before the tilted glass, among the familiar brushes and bottles, to begin the long work of assembling the day's appearance, was one of the fixed and personal rituals of a woman's life, repeated morning after morning, year after year, at the same glass, among the same quiet gleaming things. Dressed in your wrapper, your hair done, you go down now to breakfast, and the breakfast of a comfortable Victorian household in 1880 was a substantial and particular meal, quite unlike the hurried thing that breakfast has become for most of us. It was taken by the family together, in the breakfast room or the dining room, at a table laid with a cloth and proper china, and it was a real cooked meal, generous and various, set out to begin the day well. The breakfast table of a household of your standing held a good deal. There would be a dish or two kept hot on the sideboard, eggs done in some fashion, boiled or poached or scrambled, and bacon, and perhaps a kidney or a piece of fish, kippers or haddock, and cold meats from the larder, ham or tongue or the remains of a joint. There would be bread and toast and butter, and the pots of marmalade that the age loved, and that had become almost the emblem of the English breakfast. There would be tea and coffee, poured out by you or under your eye, for the pouring out of the tea and coffee was the lady's office and one of the small rituals of the meal. It was a spread, a proper cooked English breakfast in its full and generous form, and the family sat down to it together at the start of the day. The husband before he left for his business, the children who were old enough to come down, all of you gathered at the laid table in the morning light. And the breakfast was, among its other purposes, a small daily assembly of the family, a fixed point at which the household came together before the day scattered it. Your husband read his letters at the table, and perhaps his newspaper, and the plans of the day were spoken of, and the children were seen to, and the whole family was, for this half hour or so, gathered in one place under your eye and your husband's, before he went out into his world and you turned to yours. It was a domestic institution, the family breakfast, part meal and part daily gathering, and the presiding over it was yours, the seeing that it was there and that it was right, and that it ran as it should. One more of the morning's quiet responsibilities, dressed up as the simple taking of a meal. Breakfast done, and your husband gone out to his office, or his consulting room, or his place of business. The house is now yours entirely, and the real work of your morning begins, the work of running the household, and it began, in most well-ordered houses, with the interview with the cook. Somewhere in the middle of the morning, the cook came up from the kitchen, or you went down to her, and the two of you settled the business of the day's food, and this daily conference was one of the central acts of household management, and one that Mrs. Beeton and all the other authorities treated with great seriousness. The menus for the day were decided, the dinner above all, and this was not a small matter, for the dinner of a household of your standing was a considerable meal of several courses, and it had to be planned, and the planning of it involved the reconciling of a good many things at once. What was in the house and what must be ordered. What was in season and good at the market, and what was dear. What had been eaten yesterday and the day before, for a good table did not repeat itself carelessly. What the family liked, and what your husband particularly wished for, and whether there were to be guests, and what the household could afford, for all of this was done within a budget, and the budget was real. The account books came into it here, for the morning was when the accounts were kept, and the keeping of the household accounts was one of the most genuinely demanding and genuinely skilled parts of a woman's work, however little it was recognized as such. Money came into the household through the husband, in the form of the housekeeping allowance he provided, and it was your task to make that allowance cover everything it must cover, the food and the household goods and the wages of the servants and the 100 small recurring costs of running the house, and to keep account of every penny of it, and to make it balance. The books were kept daily or weekly, every expenditure entered, the bills from the tradesmen checked against what had actually been delivered, the whole complex flow of the household's spending, tracked and managed, and made to come out right within the fixed sum available. Let us dwell on those account books for a moment, because they are one of the clearest windows we have onto the truth of what a Victorian lady's work really was, underneath the fiction of her leisure. The management of a household budget in 1880 was a real and continuous exercise in economics, conducted entirely by the woman of the house, and it was far from simple. Consider the scale of it. A comfortable upper-middle-class household might run on a housekeeping budget of several £100 a year, a very large sum in the money of the day, and every pound of it passed through the mistress's hands and her account books. She was, in effect, the financial manager of a small enterprise, responsible for a substantial annual budget, accountable for its every expenditure, required to make it balance, and to show that it balanced, and to do all this while maintaining the standard of table and household that the family's position demanded. It was work that in any other setting would have been recognized as the skilled financial management that it was, and that was recognized, in the setting of the home, as simply what a wife did, part of the natural and unremarkable domestic round. And the authorities took it with deadly seriousness. Mrs. Beeton, whose great book of household management sat on the shelf of half the households in the land, opened her enormous work with a comparison of the mistress of a household to the commander of an army, and she meant it. The running of a house was, in her account, a serious executive undertaking, requiring method and judgment and constant attention, and the keeping of clear accounts was at the heart of it, the foundation on which good management rested. She gave detailed instruction on how the books should be kept, how the accounts should be balanced, how the whole financial machinery of the house should be run, and she wrote for an audience of women who were doing exactly this work, every morning, at their own writing tables, over their own account books, making the sums come right. A real irony is worth sitting with here. The age insisted, loudly and everywhere, that women had no head for business, that the world of money and management and account-keeping was a male world for which the female mind was unsuited, that a woman must be sheltered from such things. And meanwhile, in every comfortable house in the land, women were running the domestic economy with a competence that the male world depended on utterly and declined to see. The account books that balanced, the budgets that stretched to cover everything, the households that ran smoothly year after year on carefully managed money, these were the work of the very minds that the age declared unfit for business, and the contradiction sat there, in plain sight, every morning, in the account books that no one thought to call the skilled financial work that they so plainly were. The cook seen, and the day's food settled, and the accounts attended to, there was the rest of the household to be managed, for the cook was only one of the servants, and the food only one of the concerns, and the general oversight of the whole domestic machine was a continuous morning labor. The servants had to be directed, each in her sphere, and the directing of servants was a skill in itself, and not always a comfortable one. There was the housemaid and her cleaning, which had to be checked, for the standard of the house was your responsibility, and a room not properly done reflected on you, and had to be noticed and corrected. There was the parlour maid and her work, the care of the public rooms and the answering of the door, and the waiting at table. There was the laundry, whether done at home or sent out, and the care of the household linen, the counting and checking and mending of the sheets and cloths and towels that a large house went through in great quantity. There was the ordering of things from the tradesmen, the daily dealings with the butcher and the baker and the grocer and the rest, who called or sent for orders and delivered, and whose books had to be checked, and whose quality had to be watched. All of this was management, in the fullest sense, the direction and oversight and coordination of a staff of people and a complex operation, and it required the qualities that management always requires: judgment and firmness and fairness, and the ability to see that work was done to standard and to correct it when it was not. The relationship with the servants was a particular and a delicate thing, for they lived in your house and served your family intimately, and yet were kept firmly in their place by the rigid conventions of the time, and the managing of that relationship, the being neither too familiar nor too harsh, the keeping of authority while depending utterly on their labor, was one of the subtler arts of a mistress's morning, and not every woman was good at it. The tradespeople were part of the morning too, a steady traffic of them at the back door through the earlier hours, and the dealings with them were one more strand of the morning's management, and one more place where a woman's judgment was quietly exercised. They came in the morning, the tradesmen and their boys, to the area steps and the back door, for the front of the house was not for them. The butcher's boy with the meat, the baker with the bread, the milkman with the milk carried in his cans, the fishmonger, the grocer's man, the whole procession of the suppliers who fed the household, calling in the morning to take the day's orders, or to deliver what had been ordered, their books and their bills part of the daily business of the house, and the receiving of them, the checking of what they brought against what had been ordered and what would be charged, the judging of the quality of the meat and the freshness of the fish, the catching of the short weight or the poor cut or the padded bill. This was work, and skilled work, and it fell to the mistress and her cook between them, the daily vigilant management of the suppliers on whom the household depended and who would, if not watched, take their small advantages wherever they could. For the relationship with the tradesmen was a wary one, on both sides, a matter of long-standing custom and constant small negotiation. They wanted the household's business and its regular payment, and they gave it their close attention in return. The household wanted good quality and fair dealing and fair prices, and got them only by vigilance, by knowing the trades well enough to judge the goods and the charges, by keeping the accounts close enough to catch the errors that crept in, whether by accident or design. A mistress who did not attend to this, who let the tradesmen's bills go unchecked and their quality unwatched, would find her housekeeping money bleeding away in overcharges and poor goods, and so the morning held this too, the alert management of the whole supply of the house, conducted at the back door and in the account books, one more of the skilled and unregarded labors folded into the lady's idle morning. And through all of it, through the tradesmen and the accounts and the servants and the rest, there ran the constant low demand of simply keeping it all in mind, holding the whole complex operation of the household in a single head and steering it through the morning. This is the part that is hardest to convey and easiest to miss, the sheer mental load of it, the dozens of matters all needing attention, all held at once, all managed in parallel through the hours of the morning. The dinner to be planned while the housemaid's work is checked, while the tradesman's bill is questioned, while the sick child is worried over, while the letter is composed in the back of the mind. It was the work of a manager running a complex operation, and it was carried in the head all morning, every morning, by a woman the age insisted had nothing much to think about at all. A question is worth asking about all this managing, and it goes to the heart of the strange position a woman in your place occupied. Who, in the end, held the authority in this house, and what kind of authority was it? In the eyes of the law and the world, the house was your husband's. He owned it, or held its lease. He earned the money that ran it. He was its head, its master, the figure of authority to whom, in the formal order of things, everyone in the household, including you, was subordinate. That was the settled arrangement of the age, asserted everywhere, in the law and the church and the whole structure of society, the husband as head and the wife as helpmeet under him. And yet the actual running of the house, the day-to-day exercise of authority over the servants and the domestic operation, was almost entirely yours, and your husband had little to do with it, and often knew little about it. He provided the money and expected the house to run, and the running of it, with all the authority and judgment and management that required, he left to you, as men of his kind left it to women of yours, because the domestic sphere was the woman's sphere, and its governance was her business. So you held, within the house, a real and daily authority over its people and its operation, an executive power exercised every morning, even as you remained, in the larger frame, subordinate to the husband whose house it ultimately was. It was a curious, doubled position, and women lived in it all their lives, powerful within the sphere and powerless outside it, the manager of everything domestic and the owner of nothing, wielding real authority over the household every morning, and possessing, in the eyes of the law, barely any independent standing at all, for a married woman's very legal existence was in large part absorbed into her husband's, and even the housekeeping money she managed so ably was, in the end, his money, given to her to manage, not hers to command. The authority was real, and the subordination was real, and a woman held both at once. Every morning, in the house she ran and did not own, and the holding of both was simply the condition of her life. So familiar, she rarely stopped to feel the strangeness of it. Let us stand still in the house for a moment, in the middle of the morning, and simply take in what it was like to be there, for the texture of the place, its sounds and its smells and its light, was the medium in which the whole morning happened, and it was nothing like the houses we live in now. Begin with the sounds. The Victorian house in the morning was full of the sounds of work, but the work was done by hand, and so the sounds were the sounds of hands, not machines. The brush of the broom on the stair, the rattle of the coal being carried, and the fire being made up, the tread of the servants on the back stairs, up and down, carrying the water and the coal and the trays, the bells ringing through the house from the rooms above to the kitchen below, each with its own signal, summoning the servants to this room or that. The voices kept low, for the servants moved quietly and spoke quietly and were trained to be as little heard as seen. And under it all, the deep quiet of a world without engines, without the hum and rush of the machinery that fills our own silence. A quiet in which the small human sounds of the household's work stood out clear and distinct, each one telling you, if you knew how to listen, exactly what was happening in the house around you. And the smells. The house had a whole geography of smells that mapped its life. The coal smoke, from the fires that warmed every used room, the particular smell of the coal fire that was the smell of warmth itself in that age. The cooking, rising from the kitchen below, the morning's baking, and the day's dinner beginning, the smells of the food that fed the house, the beeswax and turpentine of the polish, worked into the furniture and the floors by the housemaid's labor, the smell of a well-kept house, the particular smell of the rooms themselves, the textiles and the paper and the wood, the flowers if there were flowers, the faint scent of the preparations of the toilette, a whole world of smell, richer and more present than the scrubbed near odorlessness we have made of our own houses, the smell of a place lived in and worked in and warmed by fire and kept by hand. And the light, which we have touched before, but which shaped everything, the light that came only from the windows in the daytime and from flame at night, and that fell, therefore in a particular way, bright by the windows and dim in the depths of the rooms, so that the house had its bright places and its shadowed ones, and a woman moved through the morning following the light, doing the fine work where the light was good, and leaving the shadowed corners for the tasks that did not need to see. It was a house of a different substance from ours, sounded and scented and lit in a wholly different way, and the morning happened within it, in that texture of hand sounds and fire smells and window light, which was simply the air the age breathed, and which we would find, if we could step into it, as strange and as vivid as another country. Somewhere in the course of the morning, you go up to the nursery, for the children were part of the morning too, though in a household of your standing, they were part of it in a particular and rather distant way that is worth understanding. The children of a comfortable Victorian family were, for much of the day, in the care of others. There was the nurse, who had charge of the youngest, and the nursery, in which they lived their early lives, a separate world at the top of the house, with its own routines and its own presiding figure in the nurse. There was the governess, for the older children, or the schoolroom to which they went. The mother of the family did not, as a rule, spend her whole day among her children in the way that a mother of more modest means, without servants to help her, was obliged to. Her children were cared for by staff, and she saw them at certain times, and the morning visit to the nursery was one of those times. So you go up, in the course of the morning, to the nursery, to see the children, and to see how they do, and to be, for a little while, among them. You hear how the youngest passed the night, and whether the cough is better or worse, and you make the decision, which is yours to make, about whether the doctor should be sent for. You see the older children at their lessons, perhaps, and speak with the governess about their progress. You spend a while with them, in the nursery world that is theirs, and then you come down again to your own morning and its work, and the children return to the care of the nurse and the governess, who have them for the greater part of the day. It is easy to judge this arrangement harshly from our own time, to see in it a coldness, a mother strangely distant from her own children, handing them to servants and seeing them only at set hours. But that is not quite fair to what it was. It was the arrangement of the class and the age, and it was understood by everyone within it as the proper way to raise children of a certain station, and the affection within it was often real and deep for all its formality. The mother who visited the nursery in the morning loved her children as mothers do, within the forms her world provided, and the forms simply placed a good deal of the daily care in other hands, and reserved for the mother a particular and somewhat ceremonial place in the children's lives, present and loving, and yet held a little apart by the whole structure of the household, as she was held a little apart from so much of the actual labor of the life that went on around her. There was correspondence to be dealt with in the morning too, for the letters were a constant labor, and the morning was when much of it was done, at the writing desk in the morning room, with the day's post to be answered and the notes to be written that the social life of the family required. The writing of letters and notes was a more constant and more demanding business than we easily imagine, in an age when the letter and the note were the only way to communicate at any distance, and when the frequent post made that communication swift and continual. There were the proper letters to family and friends at a distance, the maintaining of the wide correspondence that held the scattered connections of a family together. And there were the notes, the short formal messages that flew back and forth across a town in a single day on the frequent local posts, the invitations and the replies to invitations, the arrangements and the acknowledgements, and the small civilities that the intricate social machine ran on. An invitation received required a reply, promptly and in the correct form. An engagement to be made or changed required a note. The whole web of social obligation was maintained in writing, in these short, careful notes, and the writing of them was a daily task, requiring not just time but judgment, for the form and the wording of everything mattered, and a note in the wrong form or the wrong tone was a small social failure that would be noticed. The correct forms were many, and they were strict, and a lady was expected to know them all, the proper way to word an invitation and the proper way to decline one, when to write in the first person and when in the third, the precise degrees of warmth or formality appropriate to every relationship and occasion. This was a real body of knowledge, a whole social grammar, learned in girlhood and practiced all through a woman's life, and it governed the correspondence that flowed from her writing desk each morning. It looked like nothing, a lady writing a few notes at her desk, but it was skilled social work, the careful maintenance in writing of the entire network of relationships on which the family's place in the world depended, and it was one more of the morning's quiet and unregarded labors. And now, the private business of the morning largely done, the household set in order, and the accounts kept, and the letters written, and the children seen, the morning turns toward its second half, and its second face, the social one, And this means that the time has come for the second dressing, the real and formal one, for you cannot meet the social world in your wrapper, and the social world is what the late morning holds. So you go back up, and the comfortable loose wrapper of the early morning comes off, and the full formal dressing that we deferred earlier is done at last. Now the day dress goes on, over the corset and the corset cover and the petticoats, the structured outer dress of the fashionable day, and it is a more considerable garment by far than the morning wrapper, and it required more to put on. The bodice of a day dress in 1880 was close-fitted and often fastened up the back, or in a way that needed help, boned itself to keep its shape, high at the neck and long in the sleeve for the modesty the day required. The skirt was full and shaped over its petticoats and its bustle, trained perhaps, or hemmed for walking, heavy with its fabric and its trimming. It fitted closely, and it was fastened carefully, and it turned you from a woman in a comfortable robe into a lady in the full formal dress of her station, upholstered and structured and correct, ready to be seen. And the hair might be redressed for the day, more formally than the morning's first arrangement, and the small touches added that the formal appearance wanted. And there was the question of what the day held, for the dress must suit the occasion, and a morning of calls wanted the right dress for calling, and if there was to be a walk or a drive, there was the right dress for that, and the choosing was part of the business, the matching of the costume to the occasions of the day. For remember that a lady of this class might change her dress several times in the course of a day, and the day was only now approaching its first formal change, the shift from the private mourning to the public one, and there would be others as the day went on, before the walking, before the calling, before the afternoon, before dinner, each occasion with its proper dress, and each change a fresh assembling of the layered and structured whole. This matter of the many dresses deserves a closer look, because the number of times a lady changed her clothes in a day was not vanity or excess, whatever it may look like to us, but a system, a language, a whole code written in cloth, and understanding it tells you a great deal about the world you moved in. A lady of your standing might indeed change her dress 4, 5, even 6 times in the course of a full day. There was the morning wrapper for the early private hours. There was the day dress for the household mourning and for receiving. There was the walking costume for going out on foot, cut and made differently from the dress worn indoors. There was the carriage dress for driving out, and the visiting dress for paying calls, and the afternoon dress for the later part of the day. And above all, there was the dinner dress, or the evening gown for the end of the day, cut low and made fine in a way that would have been quite improper in the morning. Each of these was a distinct costume, with its own rules of fabric and cut and trimming, and its own proper occasion, and a lady moved through them in the course of her day as the day moved through its occasions. Why? Why this endless changing, this vast wardrobe, this constant assembling and reassembling of the dressed body? Partly it was practical, for the dress suited to walking out was genuinely not the dress suited to sitting in a drawing room, and the fabric fit for the morning's work was not the fabric fit for the evening's display. But mostly, it was a language. The clothes a woman wore announced, at every hour of every day, exactly who she was, and exactly what she was doing, and exactly how well she understood the rules. To wear the right dress for the right occasion was to demonstrate that you knew the code, that you belonged, that you were a lady in full command of the intricate system of appearances that being a lady consisted of. And to wear the wrong thing, the morning dress when the occasion called for the visiting dress, the too fine or the too plain, was to reveal an ignorance or a poverty or a carelessness that the watching world would note and judge. So the many dresses were not excess. They were fluency, in a language everyone around you was reading all the time, and the maintaining of that fluency, the owning of all those costumes and the knowing of all those rules and the endless changing from one to the next through the hours of the day, was a real and continuous labor and a real and continuous expense, and it fell, like so much else, on the woman, whose business it was to be always correctly dressed for wherever she was and whatever she was doing, and to make the whole elaborate performance look like the simplest and most natural thing in the world. Consider, since we have counted the dresses, what all of them actually cost, because the money in it was real and large, and it reveals something about the whole enterprise of being a lady. A lady's wardrobe was one of the great expenses of a household, and the keeping of it up, the constant renewal and replacement and addition that fashion and wear required, ran into serious money. A single good day dress, made up by a dressmaker from chosen fabric, might cost several pounds, and a fine dress for the evening a good deal more, and the wardrobe held not one of these but many, the whole array of costumes for the whole array of occasions, each needing to be kept in repair, altered as fashion shifted, replaced as it wore or dated. The bills from the dressmaker and the draper were among the larger bills a household paid, and the clothing of the lady of the house was an item of real weight in the family's spending, an investment, in a real sense, in the appearance that the family's standing required her to present. For that is what it was, an investment, and not a frivolous one, by the logic of the age, however it may look to us. The lady's appearance was part of the family's capital, part of how it announced and maintained its position in the world. A well-dressed wife, correctly and richly turned out for every occasion, was evidence of the family's prosperity and standing, a walking statement of its place in society, and the money spent on her wardrobe bought something the family genuinely valued and genuinely needed in the terms of its world. The dresses were not vanity, they were the uniform of a position, and the cost of them was the cost of holding that position, and it was understood as such, and paid, year after year, as one of the necessary and considerable expenses of living as the family was determined to live. And the managing of that expense, like the managing of every other, came back in the end to the woman herself, who had to keep her wardrobe up to the mark the family's standing required, while staying within the money the family could spend, another balancing of appearance against cost, another quiet exercise of the financial judgment that ran through her whole morning, folded into what looked, from outside, like nothing more than a lady's pleasant interest in her clothes. Dressed now in the correct costume for the late morning, you come to one of the central social institutions of a lady's life, and one of the strangest to modern eyes, and that is the paying and receiving of morning calls. And we must spend some real time on this, because it occupied a great part of a lady's social energy, and it ran on rules of the most elaborate and rigid kind, and it is one of the purest examples of the whole system of appearances that a lady's life was built to serve. Begin with the name, which is the first confusing thing, for the morning call was not, in fact, paid in the morning as we understand it. The morning, in this sense, meant the whole earlier part of the day up until the dinner hour, and the calls were in practice paid in the afternoon, in the hours after luncheon, roughly between 3 and 5 or 6. But they were morning calls, in the language of the day, because they fell in what the age counted as the morning, the whole span of the day before dinner, and the confusion is a small lesson in how differently they carved up their time. A morning call was a short, formal visit paid by one lady to another, and its purpose was the maintenance of the acquaintance, the keeping up of the social connection, the demonstration that the relationship was valued and alive. It lasted a strictly limited time, 15 minutes to half an hour by convention, no more, for a call that overstayed its welcome was a social error. You arrived, you were shown in, you sat and made conversation for the correct short while, and you left, and the whole brief ceremony maintained the bond between the two households for another turn of the social wheel. It sounds like nothing, and it was everything, for the whole edifice of a family's social standing was built of exactly these small bonds, maintained call by call, and a lady who let her calling lapse, who failed to keep up the round of visits, would find her connections withering and her place in the social world quietly shrinking. At the heart of the whole system of calling lay a small and powerful object, the visiting card, and the rituals that surrounded it were so intricate that they amounted to a language of their own, and knowing that language was one of the marks of a lady. The visiting card was a small card, plainly and elegantly printed, with your name, that you carried in a card case whenever you went calling, and it did a great deal of work. When you called at a house, you gave your card to the servant who answered the door, and what happened next was governed by rule. If the lady of the house was at home and receiving, you were shown in, and your card announced you. If she was not at home, or not receiving, which might mean genuinely out, or might mean simply not admitting callers just then, you left your card, and the leaving of it recorded that you had called, that you had done your social duty, that the connection had been honored, whether or not you were actually admitted. The card left in the tray in the hall was proof of the visit paid, and the visits paid were counted and remembered and reciprocated, and the whole slow dance of call and return call was tracked, in part, through these cards, and the rules multiplied from there in a way that can hardly be believed. There were rules about the corners of the card, which might be turned down to convey particular meanings, that the call was made in person rather than by a servant, or that it was meant for the whole family rather than one lady. There were rules about how many cards to leave, your own and your husband's, and for whom. There were rules about the timing of calls and return calls, how soon a call must be returned, and what it meant if it was returned slowly or not at all, for the speed and the manner of a return call was itself a message of warmth or of coolness, of a connection embraced or a connection gently declined. A whole social relationship could be conducted, advanced or ended, through nothing but the silent grammar of cards left and calls returned, and every lady was expected to read and write this grammar fluently, and to keep track of her whole social world through it. It sounds absurd, laid out like this, a grown woman managing an elaborate system of cards and corners and timed visits, and it is worth acknowledging the absurdity, but it is worth also seeing what it was for, because it was not really absurd at all. In a world without any of our means of keeping up with people, the calling system was the machinery by which a whole society maintained its web of relationships, tracked who was connected to whom, admitted newcomers or kept them out, and held itself together as a social body. It was the social network of its day, quite literally, and the cards were its messages, and the calls were its connections, and the woman managing her calling list at her writing desk was tending the family's place in the entire social organism, which was work of real consequence however trivial its forms appear. And it fell, all of it, to women. The maintaining of the family's whole social existence through this intricate and demanding and endless system was women's work, done by women, for the benefit of families, and counted as part of the pleasant, idle nothing that ladies did with their days. But before the calling hours of the afternoon, there was often the going out of the late morning, the walk or the errand, or the small expedition into the town that a lady might make once she was formally dressed, and the going out was itself a thing hedged with rules and worth understanding. A lady did not simply leave her house and walk about as she pleased. Where she went and how, and whether alone or accompanied, was governed by convention, and the conventions were strict about a respectable woman moving through the public world. For a young, unmarried woman, going out alone was hardly permitted at all. She went accompanied by a servant or a chaperone or a member of the family, for her reputation depended on never being seen to move unescorted through the world. A married woman of your age had more freedom, and might go out alone on foot for the ordinary errands of the morning, to the shops, or on some small business, though even she moved within limits, to the right places, in the right manner, never anywhere or anyhow that might raise a question. And for the grander expeditions, or simply for the display of it, there was the carriage, if the household kept one, and the being driven out was itself a different and a finer thing than the walking, a way of moving through the town, enclosed and elevated and seen. The shops of the late morning were their own world, and the shopping of a lady was a particular experience quite unlike ours. She was served, attentively and personally, by shopmen who knew their business and their customers, in shops where the goods were brought out and shown, and the whole transaction was a matter of personal attention and unhurried choosing. She might visit the draper for fabric, for a great deal of clothing was still made up rather than bought ready-made, and the choosing of the stuff and the discussing of it with the draper was part of the endless business of keeping herself and her household clothed. She might visit any number of the specialist shops that served her needs, each with its own attentive service and its accounts to which her purchases were added. For a lady of standing did not pay cash like a labourer, but had accounts at the shops she used, settled periodically, another strand of the household finance that ran through her hands. Let us step back for a moment from your own comfortable morning and look at how differently that same morning was being spent, at that same hour, by women a little way off in the great ladder of class, because your morning was only one rung of it, and the mornings above and below were different worlds. Above you, in the households of the truly wealthy, the great families with their large staffs and their grand houses, the morning was in some ways a still more elaborate version of your own, and in some ways an idler one. The very grand lady had a lady's maid entirely her own, whose whole work was the care of her person and her wardrobe, and so the dressing and the hair and the care of the clothes, which cost you effort even with help, were done for her almost entirely by skilled hands. She had a housekeeper who ran the household under her, a whole tier of management between herself and the daily labour, so that her own domestic work was more a matter of general direction than of the close daily management that filled your morning. Her morning held more genuine leisure, more time that was truly her own, bought by the larger staff that stood between her and the work. And yet she too was bound by the rules, dressed and corseted and correct, caught in the same system of appearances, her greater leisure purchased by a greater dependence on the labour of others, and her days as governed by convention as your own, or more so. And below you, in the households of the lower middle class and the respectable working class, the morning was a different thing entirely, harder and closer to the bone. The wife of a clerk or a small tradesman, keeping perhaps a single young servant, or none at all, did much of the household labor with her own hands, and her morning was not the management of servants, but the doing of the work itself, the cleaning and the cooking and the care of the children, done by herself, all morning, every morning. She dressed more simply and more quickly, for she had neither the wardrobe nor the time, nor the help for the elaborate toilette of the leisured lady. She kept her house and fed her family by her own labor, and the fiction of leisure that shaped your morning had little place in hers, for her work was visible and constant and unmistakably work. And below her again were the women of the poor, for whom the very idea of a lady's morning would have seemed a fairy tale, whose mornings began before dawn in labor and went on in labor till dark, in the factories and the workshops and the other people's kitchens where they earned the bread of survival. The point of setting these side by side is to see your own morning clearly, as one rung on a long ladder, neither the top nor the bottom, more fortunate than most and less grand than some. The elaborate managed morning we have been living, with its servants and its dressing and its accounts and its calls, was the morning of a particular and comfortable slice of society, and it was real, and it was a great deal of work of its own kind, and it rested at every point on the harder labor of the women below, whose mornings held less leisure and less comfort, and a great deal more of the visible toil that yours was so carefully arranged to hide. We have moved through the dressing rather quickly, at the level of the face and the complexion, and it is worth coming back to it, because the care of the complexion was a real part of the morning, and it opens onto one of the more revealing corners of a Victorian woman's life, the whole vexed question of beauty and its cultivation. The morning toilette included the care of the face and the skin, and the manuals of the day were full of advice on it, elaborate routines of washing and treating and preserving the complexion that a careful woman followed. The face was washed gently, and the eyes bathed, and the skin treated with the various preparations the age favored, cold cream and glycerine and rose water and witch hazel, and the rest, homemade or bought, worked into the skin to keep it soft and clear and to preserve it against the weather and the years. The complexion was tended with real attention, for a good complexion was one of the chief points of a woman's appearance, and its care was a daily discipline, and there was a whole literature and a whole small industry devoted to it. But here the age set a curious and a cruel trap, for while the care of the complexion was encouraged, the visible improvement of it by cosmetics was not. Paint, as they called it, rouge and powder, and the other cosmetics that we would think of as makeup, was regarded with deep suspicion in respectable society, associated with the actress and the woman of the streets, and the whole world of disreputable display. A respectable lady was not supposed to paint. Her beauty was supposed to be natural, or to appear so, and the visible use of cosmetics was a mark against her character. And so a woman was caught between the demand that she be beautiful and the prohibition on the obvious means of making herself so, required to have a fine complexion and forbidden to be seen to help it. And the result was a whole quiet art of the undetectable, the subtle use of preparations that improved the appearance without appearing to, the careful pretense that the cultivated beauty was simply nature's gift. There is something in that trap that stands for a great deal about the position of women in the age, required to be decorative and shamed for the artifice of decoration, judged constantly on appearance and forbidden the open pursuit of it, made to compete in beauty and required to pretend they were not competing at all, that the whole elaborate production of the attractive feminine surface was effortless and natural, and not the daily labor and calculation that it plainly was. The morning care of the complexion, innocent enough in itself, was one small corner of that larger bind, the endless demand that a woman be beautiful and the endless pretense that her beauty cost her nothing, when in truth it cost her, like everything else in her morning, a great deal of quiet and unacknowledged work. We have not yet touched one part of the morning, and it is the part that is hardest to see, because it left the least mark on the outward routine, and that is the life of the mind, the question of what a woman like you thought about, read, knew, and was allowed to become in the inner life that the busy morning surrounded. For all the fullness of the morning's occupations, there were minds behind them, and the minds were not always content to be filled only with menus and accounts and the grammar of calling cards. A woman of your class was educated, after a fashion, in the accomplishments and the graces, and some women were educated a good deal further than that, by their own reading and their own hunger, into real learning and real thought. The morning might hold, somewhere in its margins, a little time for reading of your own, not the household books or the correspondence, but a real book, and the reading of serious books by women was one of the quiet currents of the age, a whole hidden life of the mind pursued in the gaps of the domestic day. For the age was changing, even as you lived this ordered morning, and the change touched exactly the question of what a woman's mind was for. These very decades saw the first women's colleges founded, the first serious campaigns for women's education and women's work and women's votes, the first real challenge to the whole arrangement that had made a woman's world the household and a woman's mind an ornament. Somewhere in the England of 1880, women were sitting examinations that their mothers could never have sat, entering professions that had been closed, arguing in print for a wholly different idea of what a woman might be. And you, in your comfortable morning, with your accounts and your calls and your careful dressing, lived at the edge of that change, perhaps aware of it, perhaps stirred by it, perhaps reading in your margins the books and the journals that carried the new ideas into the ordered drawing rooms of the land. It would be too simple to say that every woman chafed against her morning, longed to escape it, dreamed of the colleges and the professions and the vote. Many did not. Many found in the running of a household and the raising of a family and the maintaining of a social world a real and sufficient scope for their energies and their gifts, and lived contented in the sphere the age assigned them. But some did chafe, and some did dream, and some did more than dream, and the ordered morning we have been living was, in 1880, no longer quite the settled and unquestioned thing it had been. There were cracks in it, and light coming through the cracks, and a woman sitting at her writing desk in the late morning, her calls made and her accounts kept, might feel, if she was of that temper, the pull of a larger world beginning to open, a world in which a woman's morning might one day be filled with something other than the endless graceful management of a household that took her labor and gave her, in return, the name of a lady of leisure. The morning draws on now toward its end, toward the hour of luncheon that divided the day and marked the close of the morning proper, and it is worth pausing to feel how much has already been done, how full these hours have been, before the day has even reached its middle. Think back over the morning we have traveled. You woke and gathered the day in your mind and rang the bell that set the household in motion. You washed, in water carried up by hand and heated below. You dressed, through the many layers, into the comfortable wrapper of the early hours, and did your hair, and went down. You presided over the family breakfast. You saw the cook, and settled the day's food. You kept the accounts, and managed the servants, and oversaw the running of the whole house. You went up to the nursery and saw the children and made the decisions their care required. You wrote your letters and your notes, maintaining in ink the whole web of the family's connections. You dressed again, the full formal dressing this time, into the day dress and the proper hair, ready to be seen. And you turned to the social business of the later morning, the calls and the going out, and the whole intricate maintenance of the family's place in the world. That is a great deal. It is a morning of continuous and various work, physical and mental and social, requiring skill and judgment and endurance, and it has all been done under the name of leisure, by a lady who is not supposed to work at all. The fiction held, all morning. To anyone watching from outside, you were simply a lady going gracefully about her pleasant morning, dressing and breakfasting, and seeing to a few small domestic matters, and paying a few calls, filling the idle hours of a life of ease. And the truth, which you carry in your slightly aching feet, and your busy mind, and the long list of things accomplished, is that you have been working hard and skillfully since before the day was properly light, and that the ease was the product and not the absence of the work. And the morning was only the morning. The day still stretches ahead, the afternoon of calls and the evening of society, more dressing and more managing, and more of the endless graceful labor of being a lady. But the morning, the assembling of yourself and your household for the day, the hardest and fullest working stretch of the whole, is done, and it is worth stopping here, at its close, to see it whole, and to give it its due, before we let you go on, into the afternoon, and the rest of the day, beyond the edge of our story. The meal that ended the morning was luncheon, and it is worth a word, for it was a newer thing than you might suppose, and it belonged particularly to the women of the house. Luncheon, the light midday meal, had grown up over the earlier part of the century, as the dinner hour moved later and later into the evening, leaving a long gap in the middle of the day that wanted filling. In an earlier age, dinner had been eaten in the middle of the day, but among the fashionable and the comfortable, it had migrated steadily toward the evening, until by 1880, the dinner of a household like yours was an evening meal, taken at 7 or 8, and the middle of the day was bridged instead by luncheon, a lighter and less formal affair. And luncheon was, in a particular way, the ladies' meal, for the men of the family were mostly out and about in the middle of the day, at their business or their clubs, and the luncheon table was often a table of women and children, the mistress and her daughters and any lady visitor, gathered for the light meal that marked the middle of the day and the close of the working morning. It was a simpler meal than dinner, cold meats perhaps, and bread and cheese and fruit, or some light dish, taken without the ceremony that the evening dinner required, and it made a natural pause and division in the day. The morning, with its dressing and its household work and its calls, ended here, at the luncheon table, and the afternoon, with its own occupations, its further round of calls, its drives and its social business, began after. The luncheon was the hinge of the day, the quiet midpoint at which the working morning handed over to the social afternoon, and the taking of it, in the middle of the day, among the women of the house, was the sign that the great labor of the morning was accomplished, the household launched, the lady assembled, the whole complex business of the beginning of the day brought to its close. And so we may leave you there, at the luncheon table, in the light of the middle of the day, the morning behind you and the afternoon ahead, in the brief pause between the two, when the hardest work of the day is already done, and the pleasures and duties of the afternoon have not yet begun. The house hums quietly around you, set in order by the morning's work. The light comes in at the windows, stronger now than the grey light you woke to. And you sit, for a little while, in the middle of your day, a lady of leisure by every account the age would give, resting from labour that the age refused to see, in the quiet moment before the day takes you up again. So that was the morning. That was what a Victorian lady's morning really looked like, underneath the picture of ease that the age painted over it. And I hope, having lived it hour by hour, you can see now how much more it held than the idle nothing it was said to be. Let us be fair to it, in both directions, as we let it go. The morning held real pleasures and real satisfactions, and it would be as false to paint it as pure oppression as it was for the age to paint it as pure leisure. There was pleasure in a well-run house, and satisfaction in the accounts that balanced, and the household that ran smoothly, and the difficult morning managed well. There was pleasure in the children, and in the friends whose bonds the calling maintained, and in the small daily arts of the toilette and the table and the drawing room. Many women found in this life a real scope for real gifts, and lived it with skill, and even with contentment, and we do them no honour by pitying them as prisoners who did not know they were imprisoned. They knew their world, and worked it, and many of them mastered it, and their mastery was real. But the mastery was spent within walls that they did not build and could not move. And this is the thing that the pretty picture leaves out, and that we should carry away. The competent woman running her household through the morning was exercising real skills, financial and managerial and social, of a kind that in any other setting would have been honored as work and rewarded as work and named as work. And because she exercised them in the home, as a wife, in the service of a family, they were named instead as leisure, as the pleasant idle round of a lady's day. And the skill in them was made invisible, and the labor in them was made invisible, and the woman herself was told, by everyone and everything around her, that she did not really work at all. She managed a substantial enterprise and was called idle. She kept the accounts of a considerable budget and was thought to have no head for figures. She maintained the entire social existence of her family and was believed to be merely passing the pleasant hours. The gap between what she did and what she was said to do was the great quiet injustice of her life, and she mostly could not name it, because the naming of it required a vocabulary the age had not yet given her. This is not a complaint against the women who lived these mornings. They did, with skill and grace, and often with real happiness, the work their world gave them to do, and the work was worth doing, and they did it well. It is only an observation about the walls, which were real, and about the fiction, which was also real, the great fiction of leisure laid over a life of continuous and skilled and unacknowledged work. The morning was full of that work, from the first pull of the bell to the last note written at the desk, and the fullness of it, the sheer quantity of skilled labor folded into what looked like an idle morning, is the truth that the age worked so hard to hide, and that we have spent this time together uncovering. So picture her one last time at the close of her morning as we let her go, the house set in order below her, the accounts balanced and closed, the letters written and sealed for the post, the children seen, the servants directed, the calls made or waiting to be made, and the lady herself, assembled and dressed and correct, standing for a moment at the window of her morning room in the strengthening light of the day, everything done that the morning required, everything smooth, everything in its place, the whole vast quiet effort of the morning finished and invisible behind her. She has made it all look like nothing. That was the hardest part, and she has done it, as she does it every morning, and no one will ever quite see how much it took. She turns from the window and goes on into her day. Sleep well.